Hi, I would like to use this session specifically to talk about roasting for espresso. I'm sitting here next to this beautiful W6A coffee roasting machine here at Boot Coffee Campus. On my right is the WPG1 sample roaster, and I want to give you some tips for the roasting of espresso. So what is espresso? Espresso, of course, is a brewing technique. It's a brewing style. It's not per se a roasting style, although there are certain, I think, very useful tips that we can consider for the roasting of espresso beans. Now, espresso fascinates me. I always start my own day with a cappuccino after I serve my wife the first cappuccino of the house, and then I enjoy my own cappuccino, and then later on the day I continue enjoying at least one, often two espressos that I carefully prepare in our La Marzocco machine. Here at Boot Coffee Campus we also very frequently have barista courses where we exercise, practice all these protocols. So back to roasting. So how about the roasting and how do we facilitate this brewing process, which, by the way, is a very extreme process of preparing coffee. As you know, when we do a pour over or we prepare coffee for cupping, for infusion, we allow at least 3 minutes for these brewing styles, while in espresso we try to extract the flavors from the coffee in anywhere between 20 to 30 seconds typically. I've actually also created some great espressos using an extraction of 40 minutes, not minutes, 40 seconds, 50 seconds in some extreme cases, but typically we're talking about 20 to 30 seconds. And then there are some specific rules that the Specialty Coffee Association has defined for espresso that relate to temperature, that relate to pressure, and that relates to the amount of coffee to be used. I'm not going to review all these standards here with you because I specifically want to discuss espresso roasting tips. Because of the very short roasting time and because of the intense pressure applied and because of the intense temperature also that we use in espresso brewing, we have to change some of our paradigms, our approaches to roasting. In the case of pour over or filter, we're looking for TDS, total dissolved solids, in our brew of 1.2, 1.3, sometimes 1.4%. And with espresso, that's quite different. We're looking for TDS between 7 to 10%, so that's much, much higher. And in order to facilitate that, we have to really look at how we roast the coffee. And so in roasting, as you might know already from what you have studied about roasting, is that we have the first stage from the beginning of the roast. We have the drying stage, where the moisture in the coffee beans starts to rise in temperature. Then when we reach the boiling point of water, the water wants to become vapor, steam develops, that pressure buildup ultimately leads to the first crack. And so that drying stage causes then the next series of reactions, which are also called the Maillard reactions, very complex in nature. And then those Maillard reactions, which start around 300 degrees Fahrenheit, are then followed by the roast development stage. And before that roast development stage really starts, we first have the caramelization of sugars, really important for the sweetness. And that leads to the start of the first crack, and then we see really starts, the clock starts ticking for the roast development up until the end of the roast. So to review again, the drying stage, Maillard reactions, caramelization, and then roast development. And we want to give enough time for these stages to evolve. If the process, especially in espresso roasting, goes too fast, then we run the risk that our sweetness and the balance in the cup is jeopardized. Specifically, it's important to allow sufficient time for the roast development. If I define roast development, then I would say, roast development is the time that starts from the first cracks of the first crack up until the end of the roast. And if you divide that time by the total roast duration, then you can produce a percentage. Now, in normal roasting for pour over filter, we would be looking for a roast development anywhere between 10 to 16%. In the case of espresso, or the roasting of the components for espresso, we really want to consider a roast development on the shortest end of 12% and on the longest 22%. 22% is very long, but you could still consider that. At all times, it's important to prevent the process from stalling, where the bean temperature basically doesn't do very much anymore. And then in that roasting cycle, if you look at your rate of rise, the rate of rise is the rate at which the bean temperature increases, usually calculated per 30 seconds. The rate of rise in espresso roasting, I really limited. The highest peak would be 20 to 22 degrees Fahrenheit per 30 seconds. And then gradually, while I'm going into the Maillard reactions, into the caramelization phase, and then into my roast development, I want to see that rate of rise gradually taper down so that I can finish this roast in a very controlled way. Remember, roast development between 12 to 22%. So that gives us a lot of time to develop the sugars and the sweetness. Now, some general tips about your Giesen machine, and if you don't use Giesen yet, then you can also take these tips into consideration for whatever other brand of your machine you use. First and for all, important to keep a good eye on your airflow. You do not want to have too much air running through your machine. As you might know, airflow and convection heat, which is basically heat that we convey, that we transfer to the coffee through preheated air, they go hand in hand. The more convection heat I have during roasting, the more I will develop acids. If my airflow is way out of hand, then I might even extract ultimately chlorogenic acids, which are very sour and not very sweet. So I will want to keep an eye on my airflow. In the case of Giesen, we have actually an additional parameter by which we can profile, which is called the PA. PA stands for Pascal of airflow. It's the under pressure, it's the negative pressure in the machine. We want to keep that PA between 90 and 120. Pushing it up much further runs you the risk that you get very acidy, sometimes sour-like flavor profiles. And at the same time, the Giesen also works very much with the principle of conductive heat, which is the heat passed through from the flames to the burner through the drum, the double-walled drum in most cases, to the beans. And conductive heat also works between the beans while they are tumbling in the drum. And so that conductive heat is important as well. So I want to limit my convection heat, use more conductive heat, and also then make use of the amazing functions, the amazing impacts of this very solid faceplate, which is made of cast iron, solid cast iron. They're very heavy. And once the machine is properly preheated, then that faceplate contributes through radiation heat as well. Talking about preheating, make sure that you allow your Giesen or your roasting machine to preheat 30 minutes. And then the first roasts of the day before you start roasting your espresso I recommend that you roast either maybe you have some components for blends that are slightly darker, or maybe you have a decaf you would like to roast first before you get to your espresso roast. Espresso roasting requires, obviously, like any other roasting preparation of your coffees, a lot of attention, good care. Given the fact that espresso is so critical as a brewing style, consistency of your roasting profile is key. That's why I also recommend to use a color meter, or if you don't have the budget to buy a color meter, you can keep track of your shrinkage, which is your weight loss, calculated from the weight before roasting by comparing that with the weight after roasting. And that weight loss is also a good indicator for how consistent your roasting style is. So, wow, there's a lot of things to take into consideration. And then, so once we are then ready to start roasting, then the question comes, how do I keep track of my profile? So am I using a roast profiling software? Giesen has an awesome Giesen roast profiler system. This software has been developed after many years of development and trials and errors, and this is an awesome system. In our next programs, we will prominently feature the Giesen roast profiler system. And so that roast profiler allows you to keep track very well of the duration of each of your stages in roasting. The pre-drying stage or the drying stage, the Maillard reactions, and the caramelization and the roast development stage. Now, how about the creation of an espresso blend or the creation of a single origin espresso product? I grew up in the Netherlands, where I grew up in a family that was very much focused, the Boot family, under the guidance of my dad. We were very much focused on single origin coffees, including the coffees we were roasting, selecting and roasting for espresso. That has given me a lot of experience to a very critical approach to espresso products, because if you're only using one single component in a single origin coffee for espresso, given the fact that it's such a dramatically fast and intense brewing process, if you're only using one component, then the roasting is really important to master very well. And in addition to that, the calibration of your espresso machine is key as well. So one lesson I've learned is that when you're qualifying coffees for your espresso program, then always make sure that you select coffees that have a natural level of sweetness. If you're trying to make espresso work with coffees that lack balance and specifically lack sweetness, then you will have a very, very hard time. With single origin espresso coffees, I think it's also important to consider not necessarily creating the single origin espresso from just one single roast of that single origin component, but let's say you have a Colombia Huila, which is a quite a fruity coffee by nature. If you're using a Colombia Huila that's like what we call enzymatically driven, it has these fruit notes, it can be floral, then consider creating a composite single origin of at least 2 different roasts of that same Huila. You might do the first roast using a roast development of anywhere around 14 to 16%, and then the second roast using a component that has anywhere between 18 to 20% development. By blending these two, you're also creating extra balance in the acidity, and the chances that the sweetness of that coffee will be way better than if you're doing just one component by itself. So that's an important tip. Now, which single origin components or which single origin coffees are suitable for espresso preparation? I think almost any, as long as the coffee has a natural level of sweetness. I'm going to share some other tips what to look for in the cupping of these coffees, but focus on sweetness. Then when you're thinking about creating blends, which I would say most successful espresso roasted coffees ultimately end up in the blends. You know, there are components that you kind of almost not miss with, like coffees from Ethiopia, Sidama, Yirgachefis, coffees from the west of Ethiopia in the greater Oromia area. When it comes to another very useful origin, El Salvador. In El Salvador, you have higher grown regions where you have coffees that display beautiful flavors driven by Pacamara and Bourbon, but you also have the regions in El Salvador that are not as high. These are the HG coffees, the high grown coffees. They grow up until somewhere around 1300, 1400 meters. You should consider that as well. Or if you go to Asia, and if you're looking at an Indonesian coffee, I would say consider Java or consider Sulawesi. So these are coffees that can have very distinct levels of sweetness, specifically when the coffee was produced using the Typica variety that can just create stunning espresso brews. And then when you're going to consider a blend, I already gave you 3 very promising and useful components: Ethiopia, El Salvador, Java or Sulawesi. Of course, there are other coffees that I haven't mentioned yet. Panama, it's an origin where I have been working with for many, many years in my own career. We built the business, my family's business, Boat Coffee was built upon to a great deal Panama coffees. Or which other prolific origin didn't I mention yet for espresso? Yes, Brazil. So Brazil coffees obviously are not to ignore when you're creating espresso, specifically when you're looking for that pivotal sweetness in your cup. Let's look at some final tips and techniques for the tasting and qualification of your coffee in your cupping lab. Here in the cupping lab, this is where an important part of the magic is happening. In front of me, I have 11 candidate components for blends. I have here 2 Ethiopians, Sidama, washed and natural. I have 2 Panamas, one from Boquete, one from Santa Clara. This one is washed and this one is natural. And then I have 2 El Salvador coffees, one high grown and one strictly high grown, difference in elevation. Both these coffees are pacas, which give great sweetness in espresso blends. And then last but not least, I have 5 different Colombian components from Huila. The different candidate components have also been roasted using distinct development times, ranging anywhere between 16 to 19%. So my next step is I'm going to cup all these coffees using the traditional cupping style. In the cupping, I specifically focus on allowing the coffee to extract for a longer time. I will continue cupping these individual coffees for quite a while, even until the coffee is kind of lukewarm. And at that stage, I will be able to get a real idea of the sweetness and also of the distinct flavor profiles of each components. Then, of each of these origins, the Ethiopia, the Panama and El Salvador, I will pick one of these 2 options. And then these Colombians, I specifically roasted for a single origin Colombia Huila blend. And I will pick 2 to 3 options of each of these components. Then my next step will be to go back to my W6A roaster, roasting these components that I select in slightly larger batches. I will then allow these components to rest for 7 days in enclosed sealed valve bags. And then I will go back to my espresso machine and do different formulations, different recipes of blend iterations. So that's a lot of work, a lot of diligence. In the meantime, I'm keeping track of my roasting profiles and then of my flavor profiles. And then I will go back to my espresso machine to do my actual testing of the espresso blends. It's fun though, and key requirement is the sweetness that each of these components can bring to the table and can bring to the blends. Last but not least, it also helps at times to incorporate components that do not have the same seasonality as the other components. So I might choose very specifically a Ethiopian bean that might have a slightly different timing in terms of harvest, or I might choose a Colombian component if I decide to also incorporate this in this blend that has a slightly different seasonality, not from the same season as these El Salvador or Ethiopian components. And then if I would decide to incorporate Brazil coffee, then it would also make sense to select that component specifically from a different time in the year. And luckily Brazil has kind of an opposite harvest timing versus these coffees. So that's it in a nutshell, my tips and recommendations for espresso blending. Good luck, have fun with it, and see you next time.